Alright, guys. With less than 2 months to go until the trade deadline, we're officially in the NBA's trade season. And whether a team's on the way to a title contention or at least in good odds for the top pick in the NBA draft in this coming season to potentially land Victor Wembanyama, I believe every organization has at least one player who might need to be moved. In some cases, like the Los Angeles Lakers and Russell Westbrook, the pick is pretty obvious. In other teams, it would require a little bit more digging. Either way, I'm going to dive into the best trade candidate for every single squad in the NBA, along with a brief explanation as to why. So let's go ahead and first start off with the Atlanta Hawks, John Collins. Collins has been in trade talks the last 3 years. Him showing up in trade speculations is pretty much an annual tradition at this point. With the Atlanta Hawks in play range of the Eastern Conference standings after already taking a huge swing on DeJounte Murray this summer, and Collins, of course, is posting the worst box plus minus of his career, there might be enough desperation this year for a deal to actually be made. Now, beyond just relieving the team and Collins of the tension that comes with this year's list of rumors, trading the sixth-year big man would also open up some minutes for Okongwu, which could help push Atlanta closer to a top 10 defense. Moving Collins for a wing who can shoot also could go a long way towards improving the Hawks' bottom 10 offense as well. Just so you guys know, Collins is shooting a career worst 23.5% from deep this season. Now next up, we got Boston Celtics' Danilo Gallinari. Now, thanks to his torn ACL that he suffered at this offseason's Eurobasket tournament, Gallinari hasn't played a single second for the Boston Celtics. Trading him in the first year of a 2-year deal, with that second year being a player option, while he recovers from that injury, might feel a little harsh, but Boston is competing for a championship. Having a roster spot taken by someone who can't play is far from ideal for a team in that tier. If Gallinari's salary could be attached with, let's say, a future asset to land someone who can help the Celtics right now, the front office should honestly consider it. Next up, we got Brooklyn Nets' Cam Thomas. Now, a few weeks ago, the talks of trades probably would have been something like Kyrie Irving. It just felt like he would be an easy pick for this conversation. But lately, he's been averaging 28.3 points a game, 5.4 assists, and 3.5 threes, while shooting 41.7% from deep over his last 10 games. It's hard to even consider letting him go right now. And with the Brooklyn Nets cruising toward the top of the Eastern Conference, breaking up the starting lineup feels kind of like a silly idea. Now, the Nets could still use a little bit more size, though, preferably someone who can protect the rim a bit, and while Cam Thomas probably hasn't shown enough to be exchanged for a proven shot blocker, he might be worth a, let's say, flyer for flyer type of deal. I don't know, maybe some other team might be intrigued by Thomas's 36.7 3-point percentage, and they might have a young big who's struggling to break the rotation, so it might be a nice trade. Next up, we got the Charlotte Hornets' Terry Rozier. Now, as the Charlotte Hornets continue to spiral toward the best odds for the top pick in the draft, or at least a shot at those odds, they should have the intent of moving a number of veterans. Gordon Hayward, Mason Plumlee, Kelly Oubre Jr., and Terry Rozier should all be available, but we'll go ahead and go with Rozier since he's likely to get the best return. His shooting numbers are way down in this season, but Rozier has at least put up 19.3 points, 4.4 assists, and 2.9 threes, while shooting 37.9% from deep since he joined the Hornets in 2019. Maybe a major contending team in need of a scoring punch off the bench might be willing to part ways with some future assets to land Rozier, and if that is the case, honestly, Charlotte should be all over it. The future of this team is LaMelo Ball, and whoever joins him from the 2023 draft and onward could really put a nice team together. Rozier's presence on the roster only increases the chances of that mystery player coming from outside the top 5 picks. Now next up, we got Chicago Bulls' Nikola Vucevic. Now, some could argue that the Bulls should trade someone else before Vucevic, like, let's say, DeMar DeRozan or Zach LaVine, but it's probably safe to say that the Chicago Bulls aren't competing for a title this season. So, seeing what kind of assets they could recoup is honestly more important. Now, of course, DeRozan and or Levine would probably bring the best return, but if you have to settle on one player, I would say it's Nikola Vucevic. He is 32 years old. He hasn't fit into the whole Chicago playing style that anyone might have hoped he might have. And during his 2+ seasons there, the Bulls are a minus 2.6 points per 100 possessions with Vucevic on the floor, and they're +2 without him. But there may be an organization out there that's intrigued by his combination of passing and 3-point shooting form from the center position. And if the Bulls are still interested in pushing for the playoffs this season, moving Vucevic and prioritizing defense around DeRozan and Levine might be the best way to go. Now let's talk about Cleveland Cavaliers' Charis Levert. Now the Cavaliers have one of the league's better and more well-balanced rosters currently. And with Donovan Mitchell, Jarrett Allen, Darius Garland, and Evan Mobley all under 27 years old, they don't really need to trade anyone. But in the spirit of at least choosing one player from every team, I'll personally pick Charis Levert. For the 6th season in a row, Levert is posting a below-average effective field goal percentage, and per Basketball Reference, he's really not close to average in any of those campaigns. And for a team that plays a lot of minutes with both Jarrett Allen and Evan Mobley on the floor, shooting from the other 3 spots is honestly very crucial. Levert doesn't provide that, which is why the team's offensive rating and effective field goal percentage both dip when he's on the floor. Now, other teams may not be lining up to take on everything I just mentioned, but an expiring contract paying $18.8 million this season screams for a trade. Now, let's talk about the Dallas Mavericks' JaVale McGee. Now, the Mavs signed 34-year-old JaVale McGee and promised him the starting spot, and all I can say is that it didn't age well. With McGee on the floor this season, Dallas is minus 18.3 points per 100 possessions, and they are plus 5.1 without him. And while he's basically been out of the rotation altogether for a month, Dallas Mavericks fans might still be worried that he'll be back at some point. If the front office finds an opportunity to take back this signing and relieve coach Jason Kidd of the option to play him, they honestly really need to take it. Now let's dive into the Denver Nuggets, Zeke Naji. There aren't a lot of obvious trade candidates on the Denver Nuggets from what I can see. Nikola Jokic is one of the most untouchable players in the league. Aaron Gordon is playing like an all-star, and it feels way too early to cut bait on KCP or Bruce Brown, both of which seem to be filling their roles really well. They could maybe shop one or both of Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr., but they certainly don't need to trade either. This team is already good enough to compete for a championship, so moves that are a bit under the radar might probably be the ones to explore, and Zeke Naji may be the way to do that. Now, coach Michael Malone has essentially moved Naji to the center position this season, though recently I should say they started him in place of Gordon after recently being injured at the 4 position. But anyway, he hasn't been able to completely take over DeAndre Ayton's backup center minutes. Now, if some team is interested enough in Naji's offense, rebounding rate, and 41.3% 3-point shooting to part with some wing defense, Denver should explore that option. Now let's talk about Detroit Pistons' Bojan Bogdanovic. Now there are good cases for both Alec Burks and Bojan Bogdanovic here, but we'll go ahead and go with the latter because his name seems like the hotter one in the rumor mill, and he's likely to bring back bigger returns, assuming either or both are moved in separate deals. Bogdanovic is averaging a career high of 20.7 points while shooting 40.4% from 3, and that's for a team without a lot of high-end offensive talent to command defensive attention away from him. There are plenty of contenders who could use his ability to space the floor. He is a career 39.3% 3-point shooter and would be willing to pay long-term assets to get him. And for a team like the Detroit Pistons, who should be committed to the pursuit of a bottom 3 record and a 14% chance to land Victor Wembanyama or that first-round draft position pick, most veterans are kind of stockpiling these picks as their priority anyway. Now, let's go ahead and look at the Golden State Warriors' James Wiseman. Now, after missing all of last season with an injury, spending much of this season in the G League, and not looking a whole lot better defensively than he did in his historically bad rookie year, James Wiseman's trade value probably isn't very high. some rebuilding team may be willing to take on a flyer on this 7-footer who can get up and down the floor as well as Wiseman does. And if a veteran who can help the Golden State Warriors now is offered, they should seriously think about it. Steph Curry is going to be Steph Curry, and his game will most certainly continue to carry out, but his window for title contention won't stay open forever. Trading some of the young players like Wiseman for win-now pieces makes a ton of sense. Now let's talk about Houston Rockets' Eric Gordon. Now you may be starting to sense a trend here. The 2023 draft has a chance to be great, and the rebuilding teams should be doing what they can to strengthen their lottery odds. For the Hornets and the Pistons, that means moving Rozier and Bogdanovic. For the Houston Rockets, I think the obvious candidate is the 34-year-old Eric Gordon. Now, depending on other teams' cap situations, the fact that he's under contract for $20.9 million next season could be a good or bad enough reason. Now, a big decline in his three-point percentage from last season might obviously hurt this potential trade too. But a veteran with a decade and a half of NBA experience, almost 2,000 playoff minutes, and a career 37% three-point percentage when he shoots will still generate some interest if he's made available. Even if that interest doesn't lead to a first-round pick or even a couple of second rounds, but there might be some team that would still consider him worth it. Now let's talk about the Indiana Pacers. My choice here was Miles Turner. His situation is somewhat similar to the Bulls and the Pistons, and the reason I say that is because there are multiple veterans to potentially move, so the question becomes which one will be the biggest return. Now the most obvious candidates for the Indiana Pacers are Buddy Hield and Miles Turner, and the latter's value as a rim protector and shot blocker give him the priority edge. Now Turner is top 5 in the league in blocks per game this season, and the Pacers' defensive rating has been better with Turner on the floor in each of his last 7 campaigns. Adding his current 40.9% from three-point shooting to those defensive marks should make him one of the most coveted bigs on the market this season, which should translate to at least one draft pick for Indiana. Now let's go ahead and look at the Los Angeles Clippers. My choice here is Robert Covington. Now the Los Angeles Clippers are another team that doesn't really need to trade anyone. They have both, wing and guard depth, and it's probably one of their biggest strengths. So a move that negatively impacts that would come with some kind of risk, but Robert Covington has already fallen out of the rotation anyway. And if he could be traded for a little bit more, let's say, traditional size, the Clippers should probably consider it. Currently, Ivica Zubac is the only center on the roster with over 200 minutes this season, and while the team is winning the minutes when he's out and they play more positionless style of basketball, the depth that they have at center, or at least needed for a potential playoff matchup against someone like Jokic, wouldn't hurt. Now let's talk about Lakers Russell Westbrook. It's long overdue for the Lakers to end the whole Russell Westbrook era, even if that means that the Lakers don't get much in return. But Westbrook's contract expires next season, and getting something in return could be better than nothing. Unfortunately, however, this seems to be what Rob Pelinka is waiting for, and it's quite possible that that deal just might not be out there. In the meantime, the bad fit between Westbrook and LeBron James continues to cost LA games and diminish its chances to make the playoffs. I mean, they did put him on the bench and allow him to play the six-man role, and he was doing okay for maybe a couple of weeks or so, but he's kind of turning sluggish again and returning back to his old bad habits of turnovers and whatnot. But right now, the Lakers have a point differential around that of a 31-win team when Westbrook is on the floor, and actually it improves to around maybe a 38-win team when Westbrook is off. That second number, of course, certainly won't blow anyone away, but if they could finish the season with 38 to 40 wins, that might just put LA into that playoff tournament. And if LeBron and Anthony Davis are healthy for a win-or-go-home type of scenario, and yes, that is a big if, then you might have to, make this trade happen and potentially get to the playoffs. Now let's talk about the Memphis Grizzlies. Now for the Memphis Grizzlies, I personally chose Danny Green. It seems like nothing has changed since Memphis Grizzlies general manager Zach Kleiman declared Danny Green as a part of this group in September, but Green is still recovering from a torn ACL, and there really aren't any rumors that he might be moved. Unloading his salary and a draft pick to a rebuilding team for a veteran who can help right now would make plenty of sense. Memphis misses Kyle Anderson and DeAnthony Melton more than many expected, and plugging a difference maker into that roster spot, currently giving you nothing, could honestly alleviate that. Now let's discuss the Miami Heat. I had to think about this one, but I went ahead and went with Duncan Robinson. Now, Robinson probably doesn't have a ton of trade value right now. He was shooting 42.7% from 3 on 8.4 attempts per game over the course of the last 2 seasons, but his 3-point percentage has significantly dropped, and it's down to 36.6 this season. When outside shooting provides the bulk of your value, as it does for Robinson, that much of a dip is honestly very significant. And Robinson is still under contract for 3 more seasons after this one. Now still, if he was attached to the right assets like a draft pick or let's say Nikola Jokic or something, his $16.9 million salary could go a long way towards salary matching in a deal for a real difference maker. And there are a handful of rebuilding teams that should be interested in that kind of package for a veteran they are looking to unload or at least have a project to work on. Now let's go ahead and look at Milwaukee Bucks. Now there are people that honestly love this guy and there are people that actually hate this guy. But my choice for a trade would be Grayson Allen. Now, according to Yahoo Sports' Jake Fisher, the Milwaukee Bucks have already called numerous teams about Grayson Allen's trade prospects. Now, that might come as a bit of a surprise to people since Allen has started most of the games for the Bucks, and he pretty much did that since he joined the team. He's been averaging 10.8 points per game. He's shooting 40.3% from deep, and the team's point differential is actually better when he does play. Some of his solid numbers are probably attributable to the amount of time that he plays with Giannis Antetokounmpo, Jrue Holiday, and Brook Lopez. Now, while he scraps on defense, it's not hard to imagine an upgrade on that side of the ball. If Allen and a future asset are enough to get a comparable shooter who's a bit bigger and more switchable, Milwaukee would probably have to think about doing it. Plus, Grayson Allen is just known to be a dirty player. Now, moving forward, we got Minnesota Timberwolves' DAngelo Russell. Now, there's an argument to be made for bigger, more dramatic blow-up trades that would send Karl Anthony Towns or Rudy Gobert packing, but it's probably too early to say that the Minnesota Timberwolves would need to go that far. Instead of a move that adds some consistency, particularly on the defensive end, by moving DAngelo Russell, that actually might be better for them overall. Now, over the course of his career, Russell has had a negative impact on the point differential of all 4 of the teams he's played for. His career true shooting percentage is below average, and his defense, particularly off the ball, is often non-existent. Now, replacing him with someone who needs the ball a bit less could really help unleash Anthony Edwards, or at least I believe. And while some of these numbers I mentioned show him to be a bad player, it's still reasonable to expect a better Russell in the more appropriate role for another team, like maybe, let's say, a 6-man role. Now let's talk about the New Orleans Pelicans. For the New Orleans Pelicans, I chose Devonte Graham. Right now, New Orleans Pelicans have a bit of a luxury with Graham coming off the bench for just 15 minutes per game. He spent the majority of his first 4 seasons in the league as a starter. He averaged double figures and shot a respectable 35.7% from 3. Moving him could open up even more minutes for rookie Dyson Daniels, though. And while he doesn't have much experience as Graham, he's 7 inches taller and by far much better on defense than Graham is. Giving Daniels more in-game reps as the primary playmaker for the reserve units could honestly pay long-term dividends too. Now let's go ahead and talk about the New York Knicks. Evan, don't Google his last name, Fournier. Now, this of course is one of the more obvious picks, I would say. Fournier fell out of the New York Knicks rotation after November 13 to that loss to the Oklahoma City Thunder, and then he didn't even log a single minute after that until December 29th. Fournier was not only replaced by Quentin Grimes in the starting lineup, he was wiped from the team's short-term plans altogether. Now, that doesn't mean that New York can't get something for this 30-year-old floor spacer with a career 38-point percentage from 3. If some team is desperate for shooting, the Knicks should be offering. Now let's talk about Oklahoma City Thunder, and I chose Darius Baisley for a trade. Now honestly, OKC could just tank and reap their numerous upcoming draft pick awards, especially in 2023. They are already outperforming expectations, which is not what we suspected, honestly, but most of the players on the roster are years away from their primes, so that's a big benefit for them. It would make sense to wait and see how all of them develop. One possible exception, of course, is this fourth-year player, Baisley. His minutes have gone down for the second season in a row, and it's starting to look like coach Mark Daniel already trusts some of his younger players more. With his 6'8 frame and solid athleticism, OKC might be able to finesse some other team in exchange for him. Now let's talk about Orlando Magic, and I chose Terrence Ross. Ross has seemingly been on the trade market for the bulk of his 6+ seasons with the Orlando Magic. Now that he's on an expiring contract, this might be the year where a deal finally happens. He certainly doesn't fit the rebuilding Magic's current timeline idea, and his career 36.1% from 3 might be enticing for some playoff team to look into boosting its second unit's outside shooting. But it remains to be seen. They haven't really gotten rid of Ross in all of the attempts that they've had, so we'll see what happens. Now let's talk about Philadelphia 76ers, and I chose Matisse Thybulle. Now, Thybulle was once considered one of Philly's better young players and trade assets, but now Thybulle is barely hanging on to a rotation spot this season. The arrival of DeAnthony Melton, who provides similar defensive value but also being able to shoot, has pretty much made Thybulle expendable altogether, or at least to the Sixers. Some other team in need of perimeter defense might be willing to take a flyer on him. I mean, he is just 25 years old and he can wreak havoc on at least 3 different positions, honestly maybe 4 if a team plays small ball. Now, if he's surrounded by enough shooting and playmaking, there might still be a positive impact there, at least for his type of skill set. Now, there is still plenty of time for him to become an average shooter, but I just think he needs to fit with a better team. Now let's talk about the Phoenix Suns, and I chose Jay Crowder. Again, he's probably the most obvious trade for the Suns, and Crowder already made up his mind that he wanted off the Phoenix Suns before even the season started. Now, he hasn't played a second for them this season, and as the injuries are piling up for Phoenix now, it's really important to get Crowder off this roster because they're just using a roster spot for him, and the team is honestly seriously hurting at this point. The Suns need anyone to play those minutes, and they should probably start thinking about accepting less than ideal trades to get a player on the floor. Now let's talk about the Portland Trail Blazers. Now for them, I chose Nasir Little as their trade piece. It's honestly way too early for the Portland Trail Blazers to give up on the 22-year-old Little, but I think this summer's moves to acquire Jeremy Grant and Gary Payton II suggests that the front office think that maybe they're in win-now mode. And if Portland wants to make another win-now move before the trade deadline's over, it would probably have to part with Nasir Little, at least one long-term piece that they think they would keep. It's probably more beneficial to get rid of. Shaedon Sharpe is an option here as well, but he's shown flashes of star upside, and at times that makes trading him during his rookie contract seem like an awful idea. Little is probably right in that sweet spot where he's good enough to entice another organization, but moving him shouldn't be devastating to the Blazers. Now let's talk about the Sacramento Kings. Now for the Kings, I chose Rashawn Holmes. Now over Holmes' first 3 seasons with the Sacramento Kings, he's averaged 12.5 points and shot 64.6% from the field in 27.3 minutes per game. In Domantas Sabonis' first full season with the team, Holmes has essentially been removed from the rotation. His minutes are down to 9.5 per game, and he's only made 19 appearances thus far. If he's not going to play for Coach Mike Brown, the front office should be calling other teams in need of a steady backup center. Now let's talk about the San Antonio Spurs, and for them I chose Jakob Purtle. The San Antonio Spurs are another rebuilding team with multiple veteran role players who should be available for trades. And honestly, Jakob Purtle is probably the one who will get the biggest return. For his career, Purtle has averaged 4.5 offensive rebounds, 2.7 assists, and 2.2 blocks per 75 possessions. Now, no one in league history matches or exceeds all 3 marks. He may not score a ton, though recently he's been averaging double figures in each of his last 2 seasons. Purtle still brings a unique combination of team-first offense and strong defense. there are plenty of teams that could use him either as a starting or as a backup 5. Now let's talk about Toronto Raptors. I specifically chose Fred VanVleet. This might come to a shock for some of you, but let me explain. The Raptors are currently sub 500 record, and this is in their positionless basketball that they tried to work, but it doesn't seem to really be working. Their front office might also try to convince itself that maybe it's not working because they just haven't had enough games to test it so far. I'm not too sure, but most of the starting lineup is in or around the height frame of 6'7 to 6'9 range, and unfortunately for VanVleet, he's just 6'1. I mean, let's be honest, that's undersized for any traditional point guard in the NBA. If VanVleet could be flipped for another wing, let's say, Toronto could move Scottie Barnes to the point guard position, which is what he played in college anyway, and they would have an additional wing depth for coverage, which would make everything a lot more amazing. I mean, think about it. That would not only give the Raptors a lineup that could switch everything on defense, but it would also give Scottie Barnes the advantage on almost every nightly game where he would be guarding the other team's point guard on a perfect mismatch, and he would absolutely destroy them. He would absolutely destroy the entire gameplay of the other team. Now let's talk about the Utah Jazz, specifically Rudy Gay. Now I'm sure Rudy Gay, of course, is another obvious pick, but let's talk about it. So Gay's net rating has to be one of the most shocking stats of the season. The Utah Jazz are a plus 13 points per 100 possessions when he's on the floor and minus 2.4 when he's off the floor. But it's hard to argue that the 36-year-old forward is anywhere near the rest of the roster's timeline. I mean, he's been shooting 33.6% from the field and 22% from three. If some team is willing to bank on that impact number that Gay's 6 seasons with an above average 3-point percentage, the Jazz should pursue a deal and open up some minutes for rookies Simone Fontecchio and Ochai Agbaji. Now, for the last team, but not least, we got the Washington Wizards. I chose, for trade value, Bradley Beal. Now, the Washington Wizards, they shouldn't be fooled by their recent climb back into contention for a spot in the play-in tournament. Bradley Beal is still guaranteed more money over the life of his contract than all but 11 players in the league, despite having a negative net rating and a below-average effective field goal percentage over the last 5 seasons. Having that deal on the books through the 2026-27 season, assuming that Bradley Beal picks up his $57.1 million option in the last year of his contract, which of course he will, is going to make the team building a nightmare, honestly. So if someone's willing to take Bradley Beal off the Wizards' hands, they should be all over it. This kind of reminds me of another Russell Westbrook situation, although clearly Beal is still a better player. Now, if they happen to get some draft capital by making this trade, or getting just more young talent to add to Deni Avdija and Rui Hachimura, that would be even better. But that pretty much wraps it up, guys. All 30 teams and suggestions for all the potential trade pieces that they should be targeting. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and thanks for watching.